The first thunderclap of the 155mm howitzers tore across the rolling fields of Normandy like the roar of some ancient, wrathful god, shaking earth and sky alike, reverberating through foxholes, trenches, and the very bones of the men who thought themselves ready for anything. German soldiers, hardened by years of combat on the Eastern Front, stiffened as the dirt around them exploded, showering mud and debris, and the air seemed to vibrate with a sound that carried the subtle promise of death and destruction, a rhythm that became almost musical in its terrifying consistency, an ominous metronome counting the moments until the next salvo, each one precise, each one devastating, and in those first minutes, they realized that this was not ordinary artillery. This was an embodiment of industrialized precision, massed with coordination that turned the landscape into a living nightmare. The shockwaves bending trees, flattening hedgerows, throwing shrapnel with such velocity that no cover seemed sufficient, and each man could feel the heat of the exploding shells. The tiny fragments cutting skin, tearing fabric, rattling teeth, as if the very air had become a weapon, carrying with it the whispered horrors of mechanized warfare while officers barked commands, the cries of the wounded and dying blending into the relentless percussion, creating a soundscape of fear and chaos that no training had prepared them for. In those moments, young and old soldiers alike understood a primal truth. These guns did not merely kill, they annihilated certainty, destroyed morale, shattered not only the flesh but the mind. And as the barrage continued, they saw men crawling, desperate to survive, faces etched with disbelief, some muttering prayers, others simply staring blankly as the world around them convulsed under the orchestration of American gunners who had trained, drilled, and studied every trajectory, every angle, every wind pattern, every nuance of the battlefield, until what emerged was an almost supernatural power, turning strategy into spectacle and fear into an inevitable, inescapable reality, a symphony of destruction that transformed the ordinary countryside into a theater of war so complete and overwhelming that no one who experienced it would ever speak of artillery in the same way again. For it was no longer a weapon, it was a statement, a declaration of dominance, of industrial might, of human ingenuity applied to the singular task of obliteration. And as the first salvo ended, silence fell, a stunned, almost holy quiet, broken only by the distant groans of men and the occasional crackle of a lingering shell, a momentary pause before the second wave, where the full horror became undeniable, and in that pregnant pause, every German soldier knew with a clarity that would haunt them forever that they were facing not just guns, but the unstoppable force of a nation willing to sacrifice every resource, every calculation, every ounce of effort to ensure that no man, no foxhole, no heart could withstand the inevitability of U.S. artillery fire. And as they braced for the next impact, some tried to dig deeper, some tried to run, some simply curled into themselves, but all were united in the realization that this barrage was different, relentless, precise, utterly devastating, and the taste of fear was as sharp as the metallic tang of the shrapnel in the air, a fear that would follow them long after the cannons fell silent. The morning fog clung to the hedgerows and fields like a shroud, and through that mist, the distant rumble of American artillery began, first low and rolling, then growing in intensity until it became a living, breathing monster, a sound that seemed to crawl through the soil, through the roots of trees, vibrating the very metal of rifles and helmets. And as German soldiers peered cautiously from their foxholes, they could see the faint silhouettes of the first shells streaking through the sky, black shadows tracing lethal arcs, each one aimed with terrifying precision. And when they struck, the ground itself appeared to explode, a fountain of dirt, stone, and splintered timber, hurling fragments that could tear through bone and steel alike, while the cries of the wounded blended with the whistling of shells and the staccato percussion of small arms, creating a symphony of fear that no amount of battlefield experience could inoculate against. And in the midst of this, officers barked orders that dissolved almost immediately under the sheer force of nature's wrath amplified by human ingenuity. The men struggling to find cover, sometimes leaping from one crater to another, sometimes collapsing into shallow ditches. Every movement a gamble with death, and yet the artillery never faltered. A relentless metronome of destruction, calibrated with maps, spotters, wind readings, and an almost obsessive attention to detail until what had once seemed like a calm, predictable battlefield became a chaotic theater of annihilation, a place where instinct clashed with reality, and reality always won, and in that chaos, men witnessed their comrades vanish in a cloud of dirt and smoke, bodies flung, twisted, disappearing under the weight of a shell's power, and even those who survived felt the echoes of terror reverberate through their minds, the sound of artillery becoming almost a physical force, pressing against their ears, their chest, their very bones, as if the guns themselves had consciousness and malice, seeking out life with surgical intent, and as the minutes stretched into an eternity, the Germans began to understand why this weapon inspired a unique, almost visceral dread. It was not merely the death it delivered, but the certainty it imposed, the knowledge that it could strike anywhere, with lethal effect at any moment, that no cover was sacred, that the earth itself could betray them, and that the men behind these guns had honed every detail, every trajectory, every possibility, until the result was something more than metal and fire. It was inevitability incarnate, a force of nature given shape by human determination. And when the barrage finally eased, leaving shattered fields, broken men, and a haunting silence, the soldiers stared at each other with a recognition that the battlefield had changed, that survival was no longer about courage alone, that the artillery had rewritten the rules, and in their eyes fear mingled with awe, for they had faced the most meticulous, most merciless weapon they would ever encounter, one that demanded respect and terrified even the most hardened veterans. And in that quiet, with smoke curling and the wind carrying distant cries, they realized that every moment until now had been a prelude, that the power of U.S. artillery was not just measured in shells, but in the transformation of every man who faced it, the reshaping of thought, strategy, and hope, until the battlefield itself became a testament to the terrifying efficiency of a nation waging total war, and the knowledge that tomorrow it would return, stronger, deadlier, and even less forgiving, carved into their minds forever. The sun barely touched the horizon as another day began, and yet for the German soldiers dug into the sodden earth, there was no hope of light bringing clarity or reprieve. Instead, the first faint echoes of artillery fire rolled across the fields, subtle at first, like distant thunder teasing the edge of consciousness, then growing louder, more insistent, until it became impossible to ignore a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to move through the ground itself, through sandbags and steel helmets, through the muscles and sinews of every man who crouched in anticipation, and as the shells streaked overhead, black streaks against the pale sky, the soldiers could see the precision with which these weapons were deployed, how every shot seemed calculated not just for destruction, but for terror, for the creation of disorder, and for the erosion of confidence in those who had trained to be fearless, to endure, to adapt, and yet adaptation seemed futile here, for the Americans had mastered not only the mechanics of fire but the psychology of fear, understanding the way a man reacts to unpredictability, to the invisible threat of death moving at high velocity, and in this moment, each shell that struck, each explosion that tore through earth and wood and metal became more than mere ordnance. It was an assertion of dominance, a demonstration of control over the very space these men occupied, as if the ground itself had been claimed, leased, and weaponized. The earth no longer neutral, no longer safe, and the men reacted instinctively, diving into craters, curling into ditches, pressing their faces against mud, sand, and whatever fragments of cover remained, while those who attempted to move were reminded brutally of the lethal calculus of trajectory, the unseen adjustments made by gunners calculating wind, distance, humidity, barrel temperature, and human fallibility. Every factor combined to produce a single, unstoppable certainty that a shell would find its mark, that nowhere was truly safe, and that survival required not courage alone but timing, intuition, and a measure of luck no one could command. And as the barrage intensified, turning what had been a relatively open battlefield into a landscape of craters, shattered trees, twisted barbed wire, and shattered morale, the soldiers began to grasp the full extent of U.S. artillery mastery. How it blended technology, human ingenuity, and sheer relentless practice to create a weapon that was at once precise and indiscriminate. capable of obliterating both targets and spirit, and with each successive volley, the thunder of detonations etched itself into memory, imprinting dread so deeply that even in the quiet moments, every gust of wind, every distant crack, every tremor in the earth reminded them that the weapon was always present, always waiting, always ready, and in this relentless pressure, men found themselves trapped between the rational understanding of mechanics and the visceral, uncontrollable fear of inevitability. As artillery transformed the battlefield into an arena of psychological as well as physical annihilation, where the horizon seemed closer and yet impossibly distant, and when the final shells of this assault thundered overhead, leaving smoke, debris, and shattered nerves in their wake, the soldiers emerged not as victors, but as witnesses to the terrifying clarity of American planning. The cold, relentless logic of destruction made manifest, and they knew, with an understanding carved into their minds in the crucible of shattered fields, that this was the weapon they would never truly escape, the sound they would carry forever, and the force they would respect above all others, the ultimate arbiter of life and death on the battlefield. And as the echoes faded into the distance, leaving smoldering ground and broken men behind, the lesson remained. Fear was the most precise tool of U.S. artillery, and it was wielded without mercy, calculated, inevitable, and absolute, reshaping the way battles were fought, strategies devised, and hope itself measured. Dawn was breaking over the scarred landscape, but for the German soldiers entrenched in mud, barbed wire, and shattered timber, there was no comfort in sunlight, only the knowledge that American artillery could strike at any moment, a force that moved faster than thought, with the terrifying combination of precision, volume, and unpredictability that made even seasoned men falter. And as the first shells whistled overhead, a chilling sound like the scream of steel tearing through air, the ground beneath quivered, vibrating through boots, bones, and fear itself, and in that vibration, every man could feel the invisible hand of strategy pressing down, directing destruction with a surgeon's focus and an artist's eye, every shell landing not by chance but by calculation, accounting for wind, distance, temperature, elevation, and the human tendency to cluster in predictable patterns. And when explosions tore through earth and wood and flesh, sending plumes of dirt, smoke, and shrapnel into the sky, the soldiers understood that the weapon was more than metal and gunpowder. It was a weaponized understanding of psychology, of human anticipation, of instinct and panic and the ways the mind responds to imminent, unstoppable threat, and the field itself became an instrument of terror, every crater and twisted tree a testament to the absolute mastery of destructive geometry. And as the barrage continued, turning the battlefield into a moving landscape of fire, smoke, and chaos, the men realized that their fear was part of the weapon's design, that the Americans had engineered both the artillery and the reactions it would provoke, turning courage into hesitation, confidence into paralysis, as each shell forced decisions measured in fractions of seconds, and those decisions were often fatal. And amid this cacophony of noise, fire, and debris, soldiers saw the deadly ballet of coordination unfold, with batteries positioned miles away, invisible yet omnipotent, communicating through signals, timing, and calculation, orchestrating a rhythm of destruction that overwhelmed not only defenses but the mind itself. And as the men ducked, ran, scrambled, and prayed, the sense of inevitability became suffocating, for the artillery did not tire. It did not pause, it did not err, and in every impact, in every shock wave that rolled through mud and steel, it was clear that this was not just a weapon of war, but a weapon of supremacy, that American artillery was more than firepower. It was the embodiment of meticulous planning, relentless training, and a cold, unforgiving intelligence applied with terrifying effect. And when the final shells of this relentless wave landed, leaving shattered earth, broken limbs, and shattered resolve in their wake, the survivors knew with a clarity that would haunt them forever that U.S. artillery was not merely a tool of destruction, but a force that reshaped the very concept of battle, a force that commanded respect, fear, and awe. And even as smoke drifted into the morning sky, carrying with it the scent of burnt earth and gunpowder, the lesson was unambiguous. The artillery had won before the battle even began, and its victims were left to understand the terrifying calculus of a weapon that combined physics, psychology, and inevitability into a singular, unstoppable instrument of war, leaving men broken, landscapes altered, and history itself reshaped under the shadow of its thunderous dominion. The day wore on, but the battlefield remained a living nightmare. The horizon streaked with smoke and dust, and the German soldiers, once confident in trenches and foxholes, felt the oppressive weight of anticipation pressing down like the sky itself was conspiring against them. For the U.S. artillery did not merely fire, it dominated, controlled, and manipulated, every salvo a demonstration of overwhelming intellectual and mechanical power. And as the rumble of distant explosions approached like the footsteps of a colossal predator, men could feel the vibrations traveling through the ground, through their boots, their knees, and into the marrow of their bones, a visceral reminder that they were no longer fighting an enemy that could be seen or confronted directly, but a force that had transformed distance into lethality, invisibility into omnipotence, and time into a cruel countdown measured in seconds between impact and reaction, and the smoke of trees and earth mingled with the acrid stench of gunpowder, forming a thick haze that obscured vision and disoriented the mind, while shattered equipment, twisted metal, and the remnants of bunkers littered the ground as silent monuments to the precision and intensity of the bombardment. And every soldier understood with a gnawing, instinctive certainty that survival was as much a mental exercise as a physical one. For the artillery exploited fear itself, turning instincts into mistakes, mistakes into vulnerability, and vulnerability into death. And the coordination of batteries, each one hundreds of meters apart, yet synchronized through timing. Maps and calculation was a ballet of destruction, each shell arriving with brutal punctuality, reshaping terrain, collapsing fortifications, and claiming life with impersonal inevitability. And the soldiers' eyes flicked from one crater to the next, imagining the devastation that awaited any who dared to move, breathe, or lift their heads. And in this ever-changing theater of chaos, they witnessed the terrifying duality of artillery. It was both a sculptor and an executioner, carving landscapes while dismantling human will, a reminder that this war was not won by courage alone, but by the relentless application of knowledge, planning, and industrial might. And as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the smoke in eerie golds and grays, every impact of an American shell became a lesson in terror, a demonstration that physics, engineering, and tactical genius had combined to create a weapon that could not be challenged in conventional terms. And as exhausted men collapsed, trembling in foxholes and mud, whispering prayers and remembering the family they would never see again, the battlefield became a testament to the terrifying power of artillery as a psychological weapon as much as a physical one, shaping thoughts, dictating movements, and reducing even seasoned soldiers to shadows of hesitation. And when the barrage finally eased, leaving a scarred, smoking, and unrecognizable landscape, the remaining Germans knew, with indelible clarity, that the American artillery had imposed not only death but also a permanent reshaping of fear and perception, proving that the combination of technology, strategy, and psychological mastery could turn terrain, distance, and even the air itself into instruments of absolute dominance, leaving men to reckon with the fact that the weapon they feared most was not just steel or gunpowder, but the terrifying intellect behind it, orchestrating chaos with an inexorable, mechanical precision that had rewritten the rules of survival on the battlefield. As dusk began to drape the battlefield in muted reds and purples, the trembling German soldiers huddled in shattered foxholes and twisted trenches, their ears still ringing from the relentless hammering of American artillery that had transformed the once familiar terrain into a nightmarish landscape of craters, splintered trees, and smoking debris, and every man carried the weight of what they had witnessed. A knowledge burned into muscle and mind that survival was never guaranteed, that every shadow could conceal an unseen killer. Every ridge could be an unseen trap, and every heartbeat could be the last. For the U.S. artillery had become a force that transcended mere physical destruction. It had become an instrument of psychological dominance, turning fear itself into a tangible, omnipresent adversary. And as the soldiers whispered among themselves, recounting the precision and timing of every devastating shell, they realized that the bombardment had done more than claim lives. It had rewritten the rules of combat, forcing them to rethink movement, cover, and engagement under the constant, invisible threat of relentless fire and the American crews. Far behind the lines operated with a calm, almost surgical efficiency, their calculations and coordinates turning maps into instruments of inevitability, their artillery pieces extensions of human intellect, each shell a precise punctuation mark in a sentence of annihilation that left no room for improvisation or error. And as the final light of day fell, illuminating the smoke in silvery streaks, the battlefield stood silent but for the occasional distant rumble of a last impacting shell, a haunting reminder that the machines of war were also machines of control, shaping reality with every calculated blast, every meticulously timed salvo, and every devastating chain of explosions. And the Germans, watching from their diminishing lines, could only understand in bitter clarity that the weapon they had feared most, the U.S. artillery, was not merely a collection of guns or barrels or projectiles, but a symphony of destruction composed of intelligence, training, and industrial capacity capable of bending space and time to its will. And as night fully descended, casting shadows over the scarred earth, the surviving soldiers felt the lingering terror, the weight of helplessness, and the undeniable truth that the artillery had not only killed hundreds but had also shattered morale, imposed a permanent psychological edge and made the once confident German lines feel ephemeral and vulnerable in the face of an invisible, omnipotent adversary. And in those moments, as stars blinked faintly overhead and the battlefield cooled yet remained scarred, every man understood that fear, meticulously applied, could be as lethal as steel, that control of space and perception could dictate life and death, and that the U.S. artillery crews had mastered not only the mechanics of destruction, but the art of dominance, leaving behind a silent, chilling lesson etched into the minds of all who had endured its wrath, a lesson that would linger long after the war, a final testament to the terrifying, meticulous, and inescapable power of coordinated, intelligent fire. Where every shot was both a hammer and a message, American artillery was supreme, unstoppable, and unforgiving. As the smoke lifted from the shattered fields, and the once formidable German defenses lay twisted and broken beneath a sky streaked with the fading reds of sunset, a strange, almost reverent silence settled over the battlefield, broken only by the occasional drip of rain from shattered trees and the distant echoing rumble of retreating vehicles. And in that silence, the soldiers, both survivors and observers, finally confronted the full scope of what had been wrought by the relentless, precise, and utterly uncompromising force of American artillery, for it had not merely claimed lives or destroyed equipment, it had rewritten the very rules of engagement, imposed a psychological dominance that no maneuver, no cunning, and no valor could fully overcome. And as commanders reviewed the aftermath, counting losses and surveying the wreckage of both men and materiel, they understood with stark clarity that the artillery had achieved what no single weapon, squad, or formation could. It had imposed inevitability. It had controlled terrain, movement, and morale simultaneously, turning every German advance into a calculated gamble where failure was almost guaranteed, and every retreat a race against annihilation. And the surviving soldiers, shivering in foxholes, trenches, and ruined buildings, felt a mixture of awe, terror, and helplessness, realizing that the guns, though distant and operated by men they would never see, were extensions of a force far greater than themselves, a force of intellect, coordination, and industrial might, each shell a messenger of dominance, each salvo a reminder that in modern war, destruction was not chaotic but deliberate, precise and unrelenting. And as night fully descended, blanketing the scarred earth, the field became a living monument to both human ingenuity and human suffering, and the German troops could only sit in stunned silence, listening to the residual echoes of explosions, feeling the trembling ground beneath their feet, and contemplating the cruel, inescapable reality that the weapon they had feared most had not only survived the chaos of battle, but had defined it, teaching them, in the harshest terms imaginable, that war was no longer merely a contest of courage or numbers, but of science, coordination, and the disciplined application of overwhelming force. And in that realization lay the final chilling lesson of Point 7. The U.S. artillery had not merely won battles. It had claimed mastery over the battlefield itself, over fear, over motion, and over the minds of those who opposed it, leaving behind a legacy of precision, terror, and inevitability, a testament to the terrifying, meticulous, and unstoppable power of modern warfare. And as dawn approached on the horizon, painting the battlefield in muted gold, one could almost feel the invisible lines of fire and calculation still lingering in the air, a spectral reminder that the Germans had faced a force that was not only lethal in action but omnipresent in its influence. And that lesson, the supremacy of strategy, technology, and coordination, would echo far beyond the fields of Europe into history itself, cementing the fear and respect that German soldiers carried for American artillery, a fear that would never fade, and a legacy that would never be forgotten. The battlefield lay in surreal stillness as dawn crept across torn earth, jagged trenches and shattered forests, a muted palette of smoke, mud, and debris marking where American artillery had rewritten the rules of engagement. For the German soldiers who survived the onslaught, it was more than defeat. It was a revelation of power so precise, so relentless, that every movement, every heartbeat had been anticipated and measured. The cannons had not merely destroyed, they had dominated, imposed inevitability, and sapped morale with an efficiency that left even hardened officers in awe. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating twisted tank hulls, broken artillery pieces, and scattered equipment, it became clear that the artillery had achieved the impossible. It had converted chaos into calculation, fear into compliance, and terrain into an instrument of control. The soldiers' faces, smeared with soot and sweat, reflected disbelief and a grudging respect as they realized that no act of courage or tactical genius could match the silent, invisible orchestration of shells raining down with surgical accuracy. Each explosion had been a punctuation mark, a deliberate statement of dominance, teaching that in modern warfare, the most lethal weapon was not merely firepower, but its precise, coordinated application. Officers tallied losses with a grim understanding that the battle's outcome had been sealed not by numbers alone, but by the mastery of technology, strategy, and relentless human coordination. As the day stretched on, the field transformed into a living monument to discipline, ingenuity, and terror, every crater and splintered tree telling the story of artillery supremacy. The Germans could only confront the reality that the battlefield had been claimed before they even arrived. Their every advance anticipated, every maneuver countered, their fear amplified by the omnipresence of a weapon whose reach extended beyond sight and whose impact resonated long after the guns fell silent. And as twilight painted the horizon in dim gold and shadow, the final lesson crystallized. The U.S. artillery had not only destroyed enemies, it had mastered the very essence of battle, leaving German soldiers stunned, humbled, and forever aware that some forces, when wielded with intellect and precision, were unstoppable. In that lingering silence, punctuated only by distant echoes of fire, the supremacy of strategy, coordination, and calculated destruction stood revealed, etching fear and respect into history itself, an enduring testament to a weapon whose influence had reshaped war and the minds of those who faced it.